Good afternoon, everyone. This is afternoon as opposed to morning. I'm sitting in my office. It's not a scene which we've had before. I'm actually dressed a little differently, too. The afternoon before Shabbat, you can see some of my books, some of the preparations that I've been making even for next week, and pictures of my family in the back and so on. My coffee cup looks like a professor's office, I guess. And I guess that's what I am. This week's video will be a little bit different just because we didn't really get to all the things I wanted us to get to this week. I didn't even assign all the things I wanted us to get to this week because it was short, partially because of a mistake I made a couple of weeks ago. Also, not all of you have actually done the responses to this week. I hope that everybody gets caught up this week, and by the end of next week, we'll all be, as it were, on the same page. We were intending this week to look at Exodus, Leviticus, and particularly Deuteronomy in a variety of ways, including some theological differences, and to understand a little bit about biblical theology. I'm going to spend a few minutes today in this video talking a little bit about biblical theology and the differences between Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and talk a little bit about what's called P and D. If you are still not so clear about documentary theory and why it's important and so on, you really should look carefully at the commentator's introduction to the book of Exodus, Jeffrey Teagate, where he points out to you some of the fundamental differences between E and J and P and D in pretty clear fashion in that short introduction. We haven't talked much about the Jewish Study Bible, but we will as the course continues. It's a very important reference, and the introductions to the books are fundamentally historical with a little piece on how they relate to Jewish tradition. What I did want you to think about for this coming, at the end of this week, is the differences, the whole sense of the difference between P and D. P referring to the priestly traditions, D referring to the Deuteronomic traditions that we find in the book of Deuteronomy, have a different kind of theology indeed. That the book of Leviticus and the priestly traditions focus on the way that one deals with religion, the way that one deals with God, through sacrifice, through the temple, through engaging that temple world. The prayer that goes on there is, I would say, embedded in the world, embedded in the earth, embedded in all kinds of things, and there's no problem there in talking about the earthly, that God as part of this kind of universe, as part of this world. The theology, and I would talk about that as referring to the immanence of God, the indwelling presence of God. God is viewed there as really part of this world and sort of the sum total of what this world is all about, and therefore the offering of sacrifices, the life force that goes out of the sacrifice as we present it to God on the altar, all of that is a much more tactile, a much more sensory, experiential kind of understanding of how one relates to religion and how one relates to God. The book of Deuteronomy and its view of God is actually quite different. The God who is presented to us in the book of Deuteronomy is a distant God, is a God who stands above everything. We talk a lot about the name of God in Deuteronomy. We talk a lot about the moral requirements that human beings have to have. We talk about the place, perhaps, where the temple will be built, but the God who is talked about there is not the same kind of God, and I would say much more of a transcendent God, a God who is not in our world, a God who does direct our world, but who is outside of that world, and we must be careful that he is not really like us in that perception that we find in the book of Deuteronomy. There are all kinds of obligations that we have, moral, ethical, religious obligations that God gives to us in the book of Deuteronomy. but we really can't have the same kind of access to God as we find in the book of Leviticus and as we find in the whole theology of the priests. That perception of God, which sort of distances the God of Israel, and the whole monotheism, philosophical views of monotheism that developed later, all kinds of views of monotheism, continue to develop throughout the biblical period. And as we see in the rabbinic and later, the deconception of God seems to win out over the years over the P-conception of God. Once we lose the temple, once we lose the sacrifices, we have a prayer system, and in that prayer system, it's the words which we use, and those words convey something not about God himself, but about God's activities, about the Spirit of God, and so on. We don't really have that kind of access. Gershom Scholem, in the introduction to his book Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, this classic work, talks about biblical Israel as taking God out of our universe, out of our world, as the Greek gods and so on were inside our world, sticking God outside as a transcendent being, and then sort of the rest of Judaism throughout all the years, we're trying to get back to God, we're trying to reconnect to God, to make that connection, but not make him part of the world, which would take away from his power, which would take away from our understanding of what God really means. So that distinction between the two views of the divine continues as part of something called biblical theology, and today we see a kind of an attempt to return to a kind of embedded view of God. Jewish mysticism wants to engage that aspect of God. God is all around us. God is in the world. The world is full of God somehow. We can have God inside of us and so forth. That kind of perception and that kind of talking is something which Jewish tradition over the years has not been so comfortable with. So that aspect of biblical theology, the reason I'm talking about it that way is that it's still relevant today. Those categories are not simply biblical categories, but they are categories in the way people talk about that today. So that's a little kind of a lecture part of this summary. And just to refer also to your comments and the question of the Ten Commandments and the Shema Yisrael, I think you all wrote quite well about the Ten Commandments and the relationship between the two forms of the Ten Commandments in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. And I had said in my comments that I don't think that the interest in looking at some of the distinctions is really just to sort of understand how the Deuteronomic piece of this understands, for example, Shabbat is much more linked to the Exodus from Egypt. And the Shabbat, as some of you saw, is linked in Exodus more towards the creation. Now it's also about the creation in Deuteronomy as well. Most of the other distinctions are not so significant. Shamor v'zachor, right? It says observe or remember in those two places. But I think it's almost the opposite for me, that the almost identity between these two traditions is pretty interesting, because they did develop probably independently. So there was a kind of continuity within these traditions. So the question is, what about the content of these commandments? And Brettler talks about them. There's hardly anything new in these commandments, but the fact that they are given to the people by God or by a God is something new, that the people as a whole have now a responsibility to their God to follow these commandments, not just the king and not just the king's entourage, but all of the people. There's a kind of democratization of this, and it means that the people's fate in the future will depend somehow on the individual's behavior. And we're going to see that in the coming weeks when we look at the prophets and prophecy and so on. So if I am not observing the terms of the covenant, that can have an effect on God's relationship to the whole people. That's a new thing, and an important new thing that comes up there. And finally, with regard to the Shema, You all wrote, I think, quite well about maybe it wasn't anything new that Brettler is pointing out in his different punctuation. But everybody is sort of worried about this. You should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. The rabbis have a whole thing with that, have some interesting interpretations of that. And I agree that the real meaning is not romantic love, that it's something else. And that love is articulated perhaps in the rest of that first paragraph of the Shema. But as I said in my comments, my written comments, I don't want to lose entirely the meaning of the word love here. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha does go beyond, I think, loyalty, because the word is used in a variety of ways in the text. So I don't know exactly how to express what it is, but there is a command to perhaps feel something. And somebody said you can't command to feel, you can't command to rejoice, to be happy. Well, the tradition does do that. And we can try to understand how to do it, what it means, how is it possible to do that. But to say that it's absent entirely is something I'm not entirely comfortable with as well. For this coming week, we'll be moving into some different areas. A number of two specific things which we'll be looking at, which are quite different from each other. One has to do with the conquest of the land of Canaan, what that means, how does the term Israel come into being, who is Israel historically, and the books of Joshua and Judges and the beginning of Samuel, how that operates, with a lot of interesting questions. I hope you'll find it interesting. And the second has to do with King David and the book of Samuel, or the books of Samuel, beginning of the book of Kings. The books of Samuel are wonderful literature. Take some time and just sit, without taking notes, without anything, just read through from the beginning of 1 Samuel until, I would say, the first few chapters of the first book of Kings. It's a wonderful narrative. Just try to enjoy it before you start worrying about other things in terms. And Tzvi Adar in his essay helps you, I think, enjoy the text. So have a good, those of you who observe Shabbat, have a good Shabbat, and hopefully we'll be in touch this coming week. Not too many people came to the office hours this past week. We had one brave soul who did it, Beth. I'm hoping that more of you will take advantage of this time, that you'll have to have kind of synchronous, real-time interaction with the course.
Good. Okay, bye-bye.